Imagine this. You set a savings goal, not an aggressive one, a reasonable one, something that feels meaningful but achievable, a number that, once reached, you tell yourself will finally feel like progress. You get there. Maybe it takes 8 months, maybe it takes 2 years, but you get there. And for a brief moment, there's a quiet satisfaction, a sense that something solid now exists, that you've built something. Then, almost before you've had time to appreciate it, a new number appears, a bigger one, a more serious one, the one that will actually make a difference. The original goal, the one you worked toward, the one that felt significant, it now seems modest, almost preliminary, like it was just a warm-up. And so the saving continues toward the next number, and then the one after that. Most people experience this and conclude that they just haven't saved enough yet, that the feeling will come once the number is higher. But for a lot of Americans, the feeling never comes. And that's worth understanding, because it's not really about the number. There's a particular kind of financial discomfort that doesn't get discussed much. It's not the discomfort of having nothing saved. That discomfort is straightforward. It has a name. It has urgency. This is different. This is the discomfort of someone who is saving, who is doing the right thing, who has money set aside and a plan in place and still feels like it isn't working, like the ground is always shifting slightly beneath them, like the security they're building never quite becomes real. Talk to people who have a few $1,000s saved, and they'll tell you they'd feel secure with 10. Talk to people with 10, and they'll tell you they'd feel secure with 25, with 50, with 100. The threshold keeps moving. And the strange part is that this isn't just about how much money someone has. It's about the relationship between the money they have and the life they're living. Because as life expands, as income rises and spending adjusts and expectations shift, the savings figure that once felt meaningful starts to look smaller against the new backdrop. A $10,000 emergency fund means something very different to a household spending $3,000 a month than it does to a household spending $6,000. The number didn't change, but everything around it did. And that is where the quiet confusion begins. What makes this particularly disorienting is that the people who feel it most acutely are often the ones doing everything right. They automate their savings, they have an emergency fund, they contribute to their 401k, they read the articles, follow the principles, make the responsible choices. And still, the feeling of financial sufficiency doesn't arrive. So the conclusion most people reach is a simple one. I just need to save more. I need to be more disciplined. I need to get the number higher. And so they try harder. They squeeze more from the budget. They set more ambitious targets. But the harder they try, the more aware they become of how far the goal still feels. Because the goal, in a quiet and almost imperceptible way, keeps moving forward at roughly the same pace they're moving toward it. This is genuinely confusing, because from the outside, and even from the inside, the behavior looks correct. The effort is real. The intention is genuine. But the outcome, emotionally and psychologically, never quite matches the effort. And when correct behavior produces an unsatisfying outcome, most people do one of two things. They try harder, or they quietly give up. Neither one addresses what's actually happening. Here is the pattern that most financial advice doesn't name clearly enough. As life expands, the definition of enough expands with it. This is not a personal weakness. It is a structural reality of how human beings calibrate their sense of security and sufficiency against their current circumstances. When someone is living on $40,000 a year, an emergency fund of $5,000 covers more than a month of expenses. It feels meaningful. It feels real. When that same person, years later, is living on $90,000 a year, spending has expanded, fixed costs have risen, a mortgage exists, children have arrived, $5,000 no longer represents the same thing. It might cover 2 weeks, maybe less. The number is identical. The significance is completely different. And this is the quiet ceiling that lifestyle inflation creates. Not just in spending, in expectations around saving, in what security is supposed to feel like, in the internal measuring stick a person uses to evaluate their own financial progress. As the life gets bigger, the measuring stick gets longer. So the savings figure, even if it is genuinely growing, always appears slightly too small against the larger backdrop it's measured against. The ceiling doesn't stay fixed. It rises. And because it rises gradually, invisibly, and in step with everything else in a person's life, it almost never gets identified as the reason the feeling of financial security keeps failing to arrive. The standard prescription for saving is well known. Save a fixed percentage of your income. Automate it so you never have to decide. Increase the percentage when your income grows. Pick a target number. Stay consistent. This advice is technically sound. In a purely mechanical sense, it works. But it contains a quiet assumption that most people never notice. It assumes that the target number is stable, that what counts as enough today will still count as enough in 5 years, that the savings rate, held constant, will move a person meaningfully closer to security over time. What it doesn't account for is the expanding backdrop. If a person saves 15% of a salary that doubles over 10 years, they are saving more in absolute terms. But if their spending has also doubled, their fixed costs have risen, their lifestyle has expanded to reflect their income, the relative meaning of those savings hasn't necessarily kept pace. The gap between what they have saved and what their life now costs to sustain has not automatically narrowed. In many cases, it has widened. And the advice, save your percentage, automate it, stay consistent, never mentions this, because the advice treats saving as a math problem with a stable equation. But the equation is not stable. The variables on both sides of it are changing, usually in the same direction, usually at roughly the same speed. And so the percentage-based advice, faithfully followed, produces genuine savings growth and a persistent, unexplained feeling that it's still not quite enough. Because against the life those savings need to protect, it may genuinely not be.
Let's stay with this a moment longer, because there's a second layer that makes this even harder to see. The expanding ceiling doesn't just change what counts as enough, it changes what a person is saving toward. In their late 20s, someone might be saving toward a general sense of safety, a cushion, something between them and financial catastrophe. By their mid-30s, the saving is toward a house, or children's education, or early retirement, or a business. The goal has gotten larger, more specific, more expensive. By their mid-40s, the math of retirement starts to feel real, and the numbers required, numbers they've heard about but kept at a comfortable distance, suddenly feel close and enormous at the same time. Each stage of life introduces a new and larger destination for the savings. And so the feeling of progress, the feeling of saved money mattering, of the work compounding into something solid, gets continuously deferred to the next threshold. There is always a reason why what exists now is not quite the real version. The real version is still ahead. This isn't pessimism. It's an accurate description of how the pattern tends to unfold when saving is treated as a number to reach rather than a ratio to protect. Because a number is always vulnerable to the expansion of the life around it. A ratio, the relationship between what is saved and what the current life requires, is something more durable, more honest, more resistant to the quiet erosion that makes savings feel perpetually insufficient. Most people track the number. Very few track the ratio.
Here is the reframe that matters. The question most people ask is, how much have I saved? That question is not useless, but on its own, it is incomplete. The more revealing question is this: Relative to the life I am currently living, what does what I have saved actually represent? How many months could I sustain this life? Not a stripped-down version, the actual version, on what I've set aside. That number is different from a savings balance, and for many people, when they calculate it honestly, it is smaller than they expected, not because they haven't saved, but because the life has grown. And seeing that gap, clearly without judgment, does something useful. It stops the conversation from being about discipline and starts it being about design. Not the design of a budget, the design of the relationship between a life and the financial margin that life requires. That is a different kind of conversation, a harder one, but a more honest one. And honesty about a system is always more useful than effort inside one you can't see. When the relationship between lifestyle and savings becomes visible, really visible, a quiet shift tends to happen in how a person thinks about financial decisions. Not about cutting things, not about deprivation, about sequencing. The question stops being, can I afford this? The answer to that question is almost always technically yes. The question starts being, if I add this to my life, what does that do to the ratio? What does it do to the margin I'm trying to protect? That is not a comfortable question to sit with. Most people prefer not to. But people who have genuinely built financial security, not just accumulated a savings balance, but actually created meaningful separation between their income and their expenses, tend to think this way, even if they don't always use this language. They are tracking something the standard advice doesn't mention, not just the number going up, the ratio staying protected. Saving money is supposed to feel like building something. And for many Americans, it does, briefly, in the early stages, before the life around the savings expands and the meaning of the number quietly shifts. The feeling of insufficiency that follows isn't a sign of failure. It's a sign that the target is moving, that the backdrop against which savings are measured is changing faster or at the same pace as the savings themselves. Seeing that clearly doesn't immediately produce a solution, but it changes the question. And a better question, one that looks at the relationship between a life and its margin, not just at the size of a balance, tends to lead somewhere more useful than trying harder inside a pattern you haven't fully named. That naming is what matters here, not the fix, not yet. Just the honest recognition that what you've been measuring may not be the thing most worth measuring. Sit with that. It has a way of clarifying things over time.